I'm back. All right, so now I'm going to talk about use cases. I mentioned earlier the work and the partnership we've had with agencies over the past more than 2.5 years since. I mean, we've been working with AI projects, obviously, for many, many years, but the advent of generative AI has really accelerated interest. I was actually really surprised with the pace of interest, ideation, and proofs of concepts happening, and then all the way to deployment and adoption. And so I'll talk about what we've seen that journey look like in the federal context. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, I mentioned this for very briefly in my last session. I talked about this concept, the build, buy, or extend. This is one of the questions or the choices that agencies who are looking at AI projects have before them today. About a year ago, the questions were different. It was really build or buy. AI, but now there's this new option of extend. So let me explain what that means. And so, and by the way, you see build, buy, or extend here. This could be, I have a colleague who actually came up with another way to view this. And so that is, instead of build, you can say create. Buy, you could say consume. And instead of extend, you could say customize. So that's another way to frame the same concepts. And so what is buy? So buy is really, when we talk about buying AI capabilities, and I don't see Taka in the room, but he had a slide which really mirrored these same concepts. So it was good to see that resonance between different speakers, even though we didn't necessarily plan or coordinate our slides. And so when we talk about buying AI capabilities or consuming AI capabilities, what we're really talking about is leveraging SaaS platforms from enterprise providers like Microsoft and many others. And so we're talking about our purpose-built capabilities that we make available to you. And so, and that's really, which in that sort of motion, you really have nothing to do except to take advantage of that platform. You don't have a lot of flexibility around customizing. It's a purpose-built, fully baked solution. You do have some knobs and controls to calibrate certain things, but for the most part, it's a full solution. And so an example of that from the Microsoft world would be something like Microsoft 365 Copilot. So it's a SaaS AI capability. We've instrumented it with generative AI models. We've built in the security model and infrastructure. All of that is there. It's a SaaS platform for customers to consume. And so depending on the use case, the question or the choice that our customers or agencies have is that depending on what you're trying to accomplish, is there a SaaS platform that can do all or most of what I want to do? Increasingly, that is true. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that is more true than it was, let's say, a year ago or 2 years ago. Now, there may always be some areas where these are general purpose solutions typically. So there may be a few capabilities on the edge that don't necessarily meet all of your needs, and I'll talk about how you can sort of work around that with some new tools in the future. So that's buy. So we're talking about leveraging existing software as a service copilots. Build is really the initial modality that most customers had. And so when you're talking about building, we're talking about using platform capabilities and tool chains from providers like Microsoft, from AWS and Google. And so from a Microsoft perspective, that would be Azure. So we have an Azure AI capability. We call it Azure AI Foundry. And within that environment, you have access to API endpoints. You have access to an environment to build and test. You have access to an environment that has, at this point, we have 2,000 models, generative AI models. So the OpenAI models, which are exclusive to Microsoft, but then other models from Meta, from NVIDIA, from Mistral, from lots of other open source models. So a diversity of models that we make available to you. But then within that environment, you also have the ability to test and benchmark and to do security testing, et cetera. And so full tool chain for building. And so that's for those bespoke scenarios where you say this SaaS, my use case is so specific that these SaaS solutions can't meet my needs. And so what we saw initially in terms of use cases that government agencies had built on generative AI was that, and because some of the SaaS tools did not quite exist or they weren't mature enough. And so in a couple of slides, I'll give you some of the examples of some of those use cases that we saw proliferating throughout federal government, throughout agencies. And the really cool thing about them is that we'd see a use case being built by one agency that was really representative of what other agencies needed. And so we were really able to take one best practice or implementation from one agency. In many cases, one big part of my role was I'd introduce agencies to each other. If I saw someone build a public comment review and analysis solution at one agency, I introduced them to another agency who had the same use case. But this is really all about building your own purpose-built, customized models, because the SaaS solution really couldn't meet your needs. And then this new capability called Extend or Customize. And so this is a newer sort of modality of building. And so what we're talking about here is there are an emerging class of SaaS AI solutions that give you the ability to customize on top of the SaaS solution. And so one example from a Microsoft perspective is, I talked about Microsoft 365 Copilot as a SaaS solution. Last October, we introduced something called Copilot Agents. So Copilot Agents enable you to build customized solutions on top of Microsoft 365 Copilot. And so what you're doing is you're leveraging all of the underlying infrastructure that Microsoft already built and deployed for your Microsoft 365 Copilot instance. So you heard about concepts earlier today: retrieval augmented generation, search, vector search. We have all of that already built within and working within Microsoft 365 Copilot, but maybe it doesn't, as I talked about earlier, maybe Copilot isn't designed to meet your specific needs or your use case. In that case, you can now extend Microsoft 365 Copilot and build specific agents for very specific capabilities that you need. And so this is one of the areas I'm most excited about, because when I look at a lot of what we saw agencies build in the first sort of 2 years of generative AI, we're seeing that they can actually leverage Microsoft 365 Copilot agents to mimic those capabilities that used to be exclusive to Azure or AWS or Google. They can do that on top of that, and they don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure. They don't have to worry about the building a user interface, because the Copilot user interface is the interface. And so that's an area that I'm particularly excited about. All right, so let me talk about, so this is my only slide where I'll talk about Microsoft products. I am from Microsoft, so if you'll indulge me to talk about a few products. But what I'm doing here is I'm showing what I call sort of a 3-layer cake of AI use cases. And so the bottom layer is where the AI models exist. And so we're talking about generative AI, but it's not just about generative AI, because AI existed before. In fact, it's a little bit weird now. We're trying to figure out how to delineate between generative AI and AI that existed before. And so more and more, I'm hearing people say generative AI and traditional AI. And traditional AI feels like it's something that's old and antiquated, but it's still very cutting edge. So it feels weird to talk about it, but we haven't really developed the terminology or the lexicon for how to distinguish. But you have AI models, both generative and traditional AI models. And so from a Microsoft perspective, as I mentioned, our AI models sit within Azure. We make these available as AI endpoints, and in some cases, virtual machines for customers to build AI applications. But this is really from a perspective of an agency who wants to build an AI use case. This is really that foundation layer, the foundational layer that you would build on top of. And so, again, from a Microsoft perspective, Everyone's familiar with OpenAI and the models that they come out with, cutting edge, generally acknowledged as the leader at this point. Microsoft, through our relationship, have exclusive availability. So think about like GPT-4, GPT 4.5. But then also we have, as I mentioned, open source models as well. We have models from Microsoft Research. And so we talk about primarily large language models, but there's this whole other category of models called small language models. And so you see Phi 4 is a small language model developed by Microsoft. Small language models are designed to run offline. So if you have scenarios where it's not optimal or it's impossible to run generative AI in the cloud, you can use a small language model. And these are very, very finely grained. They can even run on, in some cases, a mobile phone, but certainly embedded offline device scenario. And then, as I mentioned, open source models. So lots of different models, traditional AI models as well, like vision models. In fact, many of the use cases we're seeing today, again, generative AI didn't introduce AI to government, but it has certainly accelerated. And so one of the things that we're seeing is agencies build use cases which are a combination of models. Sometimes a combination of generative AI models, sometimes a combination of traditional models and generative AI models. I'll give at least a couple of examples of some of those a little bit later. Now, the other thing to think about in terms of models is that again, I talked about in my session earlier, the pace of change. And so the types of models are changing. Is anyone familiar with the concept of reasoning models? And so reasoning models are a little bit different. So when we first got introduced to generative AI, we were really introduced to general purpose chat models like ChatGPT. There's a new category of models called reasoning models, introduced initially by OpenAI last fall, I think it was. Reasoning models are a little bit different. Actually, they're very different from general purpose chat models, both in their capabilities and also in how they're trained. From a capability perspective, they excel in STEM-related tasks. So science, math, planning, logistics. They're trained very, very differently. And so we're seeing now implementation of these models to do things that general purpose models couldn't do. Like, for example, math. You couldn't trust them to do math. The reasoning models like the Azure OpenAI o1, o3, and now o4 models. And by the way, DeepSeek is a reasoning model. And that's why it caused a lot of consternation, because we were surprised to see a Chinese reasoning model with that level of quality that soon. And so the reasoning models, keep an eye out for these. These are really exciting in terms of capabilities. And by the way, these also enable agents because of because of their capabilities and their attention to detail and their adherence to instructions. These are excellent for agents. And so the bottom line is that this bottom layer is really talking about the AI models that you can build your AI use cases on top of and to take advantage of. The next layer of my layer cake is the AI tool set. Let me build this out. And so from a Microsoft perspective, so we have the Azure AI Foundry. So that is the environment within Azure where you can access all these AI models that I just talked about, but then also the capabilities to build applications and to govern applications, to test and benchmark the models. All those capabilities are built there. This is what I call the pro code or professional developer environment. Typically, folks operating within the Azure AI Foundry environment would be professional developers. We also have another tool called Copilot Studio, because Microsoft likes to offer lots of different options. And so Copilot Studio is another environment to build generative AI applications, but it's a low-code, no-code environment. And so this is a tool chain for non-developers. You can do some development work and you can integrate it into the Azure AI Foundry, but primarily the persona that would operate in this environment would be your business user or your business analyst, the person who understands the business logic or the opportunity to transform a business process, but they're not necessarily a developer. And so this is the environment that they can build within. You don't have all the capabilities of the Azure AI Foundry because it's a low-code, no-code environment. But you do have increasing level of capabilities. We're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of adoption and building of AI use cases using this tool just because of, as I mentioned, the specific persona it's aimed at. The last, and you see I have a continuum here on the left side, pro code, high control, and on the right, low code, low control. The last one is Copilot agents. I talked about that earlier, is that new tool that we introduced, or that new capability that we introduced last fall. So you've got, and this is for Microsoft 365 Copilot users, you've got Microsoft 365 Copilot, but you don't necessarily want to worry about that bottom layer of all these AI models. You don't want to have to worry about governance and content safety and controls and building all of that. You don't want to necessarily have to build a user interface for your AI capabilities. You can just use what Microsoft's already providing in Copilot, and the only thing that you're responsible for is your unique data and your business logic. You bring your unique data and business logic. It's a low-code, no-code. This is also a low-code, no-code tool, and you can build AI applications there. And then the very top layer is where the AI applications are. So the AI applications that you build, and then the AI applications that you consume. Remember I talked about earlier, build, buy, extend. And then the AI applications that you extend or customize using in the Microsoft parlance Copilot agents. I'm sure throughout the ecosystem of enterprise software providers, they'll have something that is similar. All right, so let me talk about some of the use cases that we've seen. And the first thing I'll say is that this is what I would call sort of the past 2.5 years, I describe these as wave one of generative AI. And so ChatGPT came out in November of 2022. Microsoft, we were the first hyperscaler to provide a generative AI service in the cloud, and that was in February of 2023. Not too long after that is when we started getting lots of requests from agencies to engage, to do ideation sessions, to do briefings, learning sessions, and do proofs of concepts. And so in this wave one over the past 2.5 years, I'll talk about how we've seen agencies pursue use cases, and I'll give some examples of the types of use cases. Now, I call this wave one because wave two is coming. Wave two is where AI agent scenarios will start to come into play. And so we're seeing that starting to happen now, but 95% of what's out there today is what I would classify as wave one. And these wave one use cases really took advantage of some core capabilities of generative AI, of general purpose, primarily general purpose generative AI models. So generative AI models excel at content generation. This is something I think we're all familiar with. They also excel in analysis of unstructured data. And by the way, it just so happens that most content within organizations and agencies is unstructured data. Think about all of your documents. Think about your research papers. Think about your policy documents. Think about the example I gave earlier, public comments. Think about citizen interactions. All of that is unstructured data, which previously we needed a human to analyze, reason, and search through. The key insight with generative AI is now we have a tool, an AI tool, that can do that. So for the first time, we have technology that can analyze, reason over, search through unstructured data. And so a lot of the use cases we've seen really take advantage of that. Code generation is something else that generative AI is really good at. Code generation as well as code documentation of legacy code. Like, what is this legacy code doing? That's another capability. Searching on public and private data. And so searching on public data would be, so one of the very first use cases that we saw from agencies who implemented Azure AI capabilities was that, Taka talked about this earlier. So ChatGPT came out, everyone was stunned at the capabilities, and they started to copy and paste agency data, organizational data into ChatGPT to summarize. And so agencies said, hey, we get it. this is amazing, but don't do that. And so one of the first things that we saw agencies do is they partnered with us to figure out how can they stand up their own agency GPT within the agency guardrails, within the agency governance boundary, within the agency data protection policies. And so we saw a lot of that. And so I call that public data because these AI models, generative AI models, are trained on public data. And so, but the agencies just didn't want them copying and pasting because of terms of use, et cetera, agency data in there. So once those were in place and agencies felt good about that, the next thing they said was, what about our private data that the models have never been trained on? Like we have this policy data that we want to enable conversational access for our people to chat against. And so that was the next thing. That's what I mean by private data. The last category is citizen service. By the way, I have another version of this slide populated with example use cases from throughout the federal government. Ping me on if you're a government agency looking to explore that, reach out to me on LinkedIn, happy to go through. Wasn't sure, I took it out because I didn't know there was media, and some agencies just don't want their use cases to talk about publicly. But what I'll do now is I'll give you some of the examples without talking about which agencies built those examples. But again, reach out to me if you want to have an agency-to-agency conversation to learn about how agencies are using generative AI. So starting with I talked about the generative AI capabilities in this wave one, pre-agent and pre-reasoning model environment. But then the other thing that we saw agencies doing, going back to my first talk, was really aligning these use cases to agency strategy and agency mission. So not AI for the sake of AI, like how can I build an AI use case which is integral to moving the needle on something that the agency is in a strategic plan or in other forms called out as important. And so the way to do that is really look across the agency processes. And so think about the functional organizations like customer service or citizen service and experience, procurement, finance, IT, HR, legal, and then obviously everything that falls under the agency mission. That's where we saw agencies really leaning in. A couple of examples. And so in the customer service arena, where agencies are I was really surprised at the adventurousness of agencies, but it's actually working out. Externally facing chatbots. And so we have several agencies we work with who have stood up chatbots on their websites to help support citizen conversations and to scale themselves 24/7 to assist citizens and small businesses. And so amazing results there. Another example I'll call out under customer service is there's an agency that was plagued, an agency we partner with that was plagued with long call center volumes. They got lots of criticisms from citizen advocacy groups, from Congress about these long call centers. And so, but they didn't have any they recorded the calls, but we all heard the messages, this call is being recorded to improve customer service. But the question is anyone going to listen to these recordings? Well, at the scale of calls they were getting, it was simply impossible for humans to do it. They didn't have the workforce, the labor force to do that. AI could do that. And so what they use is a combination of traditional AI. So they used, in the Microsoft suite, we have Azure speech to text. And so they use Azure AI to transcribe hundreds of thousands of call center calls into text transcripts. And then they use generative AI, the Azure OpenAI capability, to actually read through and analyze those calls. And for the first time ever, they now had an understanding of what was driving the majority of their call center calls. And so that's an example that fits under that customer service space. Procurement, we're seeing a lot here. from agencies using generative AI to analyze contracts and to actually pull out, you've got these long contracts. In some cases, these contracts are written in different languages. They're not standardized in their format, but they all have specific things that we care about and that we want to pull out from each one of them. So this is that I talked about earlier, that unstructured data problem that previously we needed a human to read through these documents. They're now using generative AI to get maybe just certain terms and conditions from these contracts and pulling these out, and using them for analysis a little bit later. The other big one is in the rulemaking process, public comment, review, and analysis. And so think about all the public comments that are coming in. By the way, increasingly where you have trade groups who are increasingly using generative AI themselves and with their stakeholders to flood agencies with these public comments that have to be statutorily read and understood. And so we now have agencies who are using generative AI to read through those public classify, and do sentiment analysis on public comments. And so that's an exciting one as well. Finance, one of the ones I'll call out is I'll call FEMA. It's at FEMA GPT. Chris Kraft. Does anyone know the name Chris Kraft? He's an amazing AI leader. I met him here at the partnership. He was part of the AI leadership program, I think about 2 years ago. He conceived and really pushed through FEMA GPT, which is a budget, which is an AI assistant to help FEMA read through budget documents. They were getting a lot of calls from the Hill. I think he said 54 a week, if I'm remembering correctly, from Congress around different aspects of their budget data. And so it was all in there, but it was just taxing from a time perspective. And so they built an AI assistant to help FEMA employees find that information quickly, find the source materials, and respond. But then also I talked about contract analysis as well. Lots of finance examples. This is one of the emerging areas, especially with the reasoning models I talked about, which can do math and understand quantitative data and combine that with unstructured data as well. A lot of IT use cases, as you would expect. A lot of IT. What we're seeing IT do is from using generative AI to do security analysis of security telemetry, reverse engineering code, but then also code modernization. And so working with several agencies who have legacy code. In some cases, the code is so niche and unique that you really don't have a lot of people around who fully understand it. Generative AI, turns out, can understand that code, explain what the code is doing, document that code, and then convert it into a modern language like Python. And so a lot of exciting things there. HR. So Taka talked about position description and classification. That is an amazing use case. It's something that in the government context is a long tail in the hiring process. And generative AI is certainly is something that's helping them. A lot of other use cases in HR. I talked to a Chico yesterday around a self-service capability that they want to implement in this agency. In fact, using Copilot agents. I talked about that. So this is an agency that's already piloting Microsoft 365 Copilot. And our conversation yesterday was around, so HR has, so they have a sort of several parts of the agency, and each one of those parts has its own HR. What they're trying to do right now, centralize HR. As part of that centralization, what they want to get to is one version of the truth in terms of authoritative HR policy documents. And so what we talked about yesterday was how do you build a Copilot agent on just this authoritative HR data that we've identified. We make that available as an HR employee assistant for everyone in Copilot, and now they know to go to that tool to get all of the authoritative data. So a lot of potential there with HR, legal and policy. Several agencies have stood up a policy chatbot within their organization to help their employees. This is an example where I talked about generative AI. These generative AI models, ChatGPT, Gemini, et cetera, Anthropic, they have general data, but in many cases, they don't have the specifics of agency data. So agencies are building policy chatbots that are grounded on using retrieval augmented generation, talked about it earlier, grounded on their specific agency data, and that enable conversational back and forth and question answering. And then agency mission, the use cases, many use cases. It depends on the agency. For me, this is the most exciting part of the work that we get to do, because we get to work with like the litigation components of agencies, and we get to understand some of the problems that they have, and we get to brainstorm around generative AI solutions to some of those problems and implement those and pilot those. And so think of the agency and think about the mission associated with that agency or the missions associated with those agencies. Many use cases fall under there. I think I'm out of time. Just one more slide. The last thing is governance and risk management. So Martin talked about this earlier. So we are big believers of the NIST AI risk management framework as an existing model to help agencies think through how to identify, how to measure, how to mitigate, and how to operationalize AI governance. Martin also talked about some of the unique risks exacerbated by generative AI. That's well documented in the generative AI profile that NIST has stood up as well. And so that's the last really piece of the component, not necessarily in order, but it's last in my slides, but it should be thought about from the very beginning in terms of the AI use cases before they're deployed, taking a risk-based approach, being thoughtful about which use cases are selected and how you go about implementing and mitigating risk. That's all the time I have.